Hello, everyone. We're going to get started for those who have gotten up and survived from last evening. We're going to start today with celebrating a special class, a class of 1964. Now, they think they're special because it's their 50th reunion. They're special because it's the same year I graduated from Johns Hopkins. That's right. That's right. So we share that very deeply. That class, if you want to see what they looked like, that's on the front of your program. That is the class, and there is right smack in the middle of it is it's Alan Polanski. There you are. Well, you're preserved for posterity on the cover of this year's program. There were, in fact, a total of 68 students in that class, and they came from 13 countries. Milton Eisenhower was the president of the university. An aside, I went to Columbia earlier where Dwight Eisenhower was president, but Milton was the scholar, and the story is that people at Columbia thought they'd hired Milton. But he was busy at the time here at Johns Hopkins. Grove Haynes was the director, the starting director. The tuition was very difficult. It was $800. It's more than $43,000 this year, just to give you some sense how much more depending on the exchange rate on any particular day. But it is true that 85% of the students had some kind of financial aid, and that included 97% of the non-Americans. Today those numbers are 40% and 71% for non-Americans, which is why you keep hearing me talk about scholarships and the need for providing that same opportunity to the students who are here today. And now a 50th anniversary is a very special occasion, and there are with us 8 members of the class, and we've established a tradition. An aside, I spent the 1972-73 year in Southern California, San Diego, on sabbatical, and I was not a Californian, so I didn't understand their culture, but I was in Los Angeles one day and passed a store that said, "Hero Sandwiches and Objet d'Art," a tradition since 1971. So this tradition that we're introducing here today has been a special tradition since 2013. This is the second year in which what we want to do is to give a small award, a certificate to each of the graduates that are with us. And I'm going to call their names out and hold your applause until we have introduced all of them and then give vent to your emotion. Robert Carr. And we have somebody who will give you your certificate. No, stand up. You can see standing. We can still do that. Anna Maria Gentili. Gary Judd. Peter Pierce. Alan Polanski, our model. Robert Vandenplas. Herman Warnier. And Anne Cipriani Webb. Okay. Now, to the class of 1964. Okay. Okay. By the way, we are duplicating the course catalog from 1964 that I talked about last night, and I think we are. Is it true that we're making copies for everyone? I think I'd heard that we were going to make copies for for all of you. Okay, there you have it. Okay, well, you know, I spent some time last night reading the titles of the courses we taught, and those courses were clearly relevant to the world of 1964, but not necessarily to the world of 2014, and that's hardly a surprise. Just think of the changes that have occurred since then. We've moved from a bipolar world to a brief period when we talked about unipolarity, past the illusion of multipolarity, which turned out to be too simple a notion. We've seen the emergence of the BRICS. We've seen We've had a flirtation with Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and Fukuyama's End of History. We've seen the emergence of non-state actors and new kinds of ethnic conflict. We've moved away from this kind of Manichaean dichotomy of good and evil in the world to something more complicated. And we no longer, well, some of us talk about America, the indispensable nation, but not certainly the invincible nation. And our Dean Vali Nasr has actually written a book suggesting that maybe indispensable is not the right word either. But there have been many other changes. The information society has, and the economy have led to systemic instabilities that we've suffered over these last several years. We've changed the nature of warfare. You heard yesterday some of the concerns we now have where scientists in the civilian sector have to be involved in the control of nuclear weapons and other things. But we have other kinds of weaponry which has changed the nature of warfare so that nations don't fight battles on clearly defined fields of battle. We have overlaps between civilian society and military and security issues. The globalization, the new dimensions of competition, the energy and environment. In the face of those changes, it's not surprising that we spend a great deal of time here at SAIS thinking about what we teach and how we teach it. And we deal with a number of puzzling problems. We deal with the graduate professional school dichotomy, that we are in fact a professional school aimed very clearly at people's careers, but we argue that in order to actually deal with those kinds of areas, you have to have the depth of a graduate school. So we're seeking ways of combining the depth of knowledge of a graduate school with the focus that you need for a professional career. We're seeking to be relevant, but not simply fashionable. I was trained as a chemical engineer, which is a perfect training for international affairs, obviously. And one of the things that struck me in years of teaching it was that I never taught a subject that I had taken as an undergraduate. One of my undergraduate courses at Columbia in the last century, at least the last century, was a course called Crushing and Grinding. Now, I never taught crushing and grinding again, but for a few moments it was a very valuable and important thing to know. It just passed us by quickly. Well, so what we're interested in is how do you define a practical curriculum that serves not today's problems but tomorrow's problems? And so what we're struggling with in a healthy way is thinking about our core curriculum. What are the courses that everyone ought to take? Thinking about an issue I mentioned last night, which in the jargon we call functional concentrations versus regional concentrations. You deal with conflict management and strategic studies and energy and resources and environment, or do you deal with the Middle East or Latin America or Europe along the way? And many of us feel that you have to find ways of combining those, that you need to have some analytical framework, which are the functional concentrations, but you need to have some knowledge of an area, which are the regional concentrations, and we're struggling with how to make that happen. How many different courses should we offer? We offer about 80 courses here. There's about 200 that are taught in Washington. Is that too many, too little? Are they the right courses? How do you pursue a multidisciplinary education, but not a superficial one? How do you get depth, but still recognize that no problems can be handled in one way? There's a quote that I use very frequently of H.J. Mackinder, who was a political geographer at Oxford at the beginning of the 20th century. And his line, I don't agree with any of his theories, but his line that was wonderful was that all knowledge is one. Its division into subjects is a concession to human weakness. It captures an enormously important idea that we do specialize because that's the only way we can master fields. But if we don't figure out ways of putting it back together, we don't really achieve the kind of practical understanding that we need. So one of the things that I love about SAIS and SAIS Bologna is that it's a place of experimentation. We're dealing with all of these kinds of issues and trying to find sensible ways of approaching it. So we're trying different course formats. John Harper mentioned our half-semester courses. There's material that doesn't fit the shoe. It doesn't fit It's either too little for a course or too much for a half course. So we try that. We are trying thematic seminar series rather than the Catch as Catch Can, who's the speaker in town this week. We're thinking much more about organizing it around themes, the themes developed by our full-time faculty who will work in certain areas. We're thinking about a seminar series and acting on them. You'll hear from Mark Gilbert. Mark and David Unger just this week finished a 4-part seminar series on conceptualizing transatlantic politics. And this wasn't a credit course. This was a discussion. And what they proposed was reading seminal articles by people like Kennan and Servan-Schreiber and Fukuyama and talking about them. No course credit, just learning something. We have scholars in residence now. Professor Melvin Leffler from the University of Virginia, a very well-known historian, will be coming here next week and spending 2 or 3 weeks just talking, hanging around, being in the bar, and that's a way of learning. It's another experimentation. And Elliot Cohen, our favorite neocon colleague from Washington, came here on his sabbatical in the fall, and he and I talked, and I said, well, Elliot, don't teach a regular course. God knows we wouldn't want you to. That's not true. He's a marvelous teacher. That's my joke, and if he were here, he'd appreciate it. What he did was give a series of 4 weekly lectures on Shakespeare and war. And he took a play each week, and we read the play, and then we talked about the things which are relevant to why people go to war, what are leaders like, what are the motivations of the populace, what are the motivations of the people in charge. It was an extraordinary experience, and again, looking for connections that will help to give some depth to our students in their knowledge, and in revelation, because frequently revelation comes from bringing 2 disparate fields together in some way that creates a creative insight. So we're constantly thinking and looking for organizing themes and organizing activities, and in that our students are equally involved, and that's my segue into the next part of the program, which is a panel that will introduce you to the Bologna Journal of International Affairs, which is now in, what is it, 17? The 17th year of its being produced entirely by students at the center. And each year they choose a theme because they too are looking for unifying frameworks for looking at the issues that we confront in the world. And I'm going to leave to them and to Mark to introduce the subject and tell you about how Stalemates arose. Yes, that's a question. Well, I think that's perfectly appropriate, and yeah. Yeah. Yes.
He was a very good teacher, but also in memory of all our colleagues who disappeared.
Who are not here.
After 50 years of class, there are many of them.
Oh, capito.
I think it's very important that looking to the future, size Europe is also looking to the past.
Thank you very much, and I think that's very appropriate. And one of the things that I think I have always felt, and I think most of my colleagues here have felt, is that we have an obligation to recognize and to perpetuate, to make sure that it's continued. This is a continuity in which we have a history now of almost 60 years, and we feel an obligation to, in many of the things I've just said, to carry that forward, to act, in fact, to honor that very distinguished past by thinking about the future and how we continue it in these next years. But it's perfectly appropriate to remember that there are many who are not with us, who are, except in spirit. Spinelli's name is on the door of my office, as is appropriate. And so can we take a moment of silence and think about the connection to people who are no longer with us, but who have meant a lot to us? And now, in the same spirit, let's look to the future.
Just one microphone at a time, everybody, okay? Well, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many people here for this panel on the Bologna Center Journal of International Affairs and its theme, Stalemate, for this year. We were talking yesterday. John Harper made a very moving tribute to Ken's work during his time as director here. And one other thing that Ken has done over the last few years in particular is try to give pride of place in the student body, in the student life, in relations with the alumni too, of the Bologna Center Journal for International Affairs. As Ken said in his introductory remarks, this is an entirely student-managed journal. They have an academic advisor, that's me, but I think they'll all agree I give them a lot of latitude. They choose at the beginning of the year an editor and a theme in a meeting of students who are involved, who are interested in the journal, and the editor then selects his or her team, and throughout the year they work on producing a genuine peer-reviewed academic journal on questions of international relations. Their theme for this year was Stalemates in International Affairs, and that's going to be the topic of today's panel. In accordance with a new tradition going back until 2011, we have a distinguished scholar of international affairs who's going to be speaking to the topic of Stalemates in International Affairs, and that's Beatrice Heuser, who's going to give her thoughts on them. Beatrice is Chair of International Relations at Reading University. Previously, she was Director of Research in the Military Research Office of the German Army, and before that, Professor of War Studies at King's College in London. She's the author of many distinguished books on Cold War history and military history and strategy. Perhaps notably, I'm just choosing two out of a very long list, her books, The Evolution of Strategy, Thinking War from Antiquity to the Present, and also a book that she published in, I think, 2002, 2003, called Reading Clausewitz. But before we listen to Professor Heuser's lecture, I'd just like to introduce the team this year, the people who put together the journal, as you can see with its rather striking frontispiece, this rather striking front cover. To my left here, on the left, is Jeffrey Wright, this year's editor. Jeff is from Philadelphia, a graduate of Kenyon College. He's a Middle East Studies and Strategic Studies concentrator, and I will make him blush now by assuring you, as I know from one of my classes, that he's a very fine writer indeed. Fellow panelists here, his fellow students and collaborators, people who have contributed to the journal this year, who have had articles accepted after a peer review process, include Fritz Lodge, where's Fritz? Who, despite the fact he is concentrating in strategic studies here at SAIS, he's a graduate of St. Andrews University, where, despite the fact he looks vaguely like Prince William, he didn't marry Kate Middleton. I couldn't resist that joke. I've been preparing it all week. And spent the last 3 years working in Cairo as a research assistant to Nabil Fahmy, the former dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo, and who is, of course, currently Egypt's foreign minister. Jagbantha Nigthujam is an MA candidate concentrating in international economics and international development here at SAIS, native of India. Jag previously worked as an energy consultant in Singapore, where he was the regional analyst for gas and power covering Asia. I remember vividly my interview with him when we interviewed him as part of the interview process. Here we had somebody who was an engineer, he was studying science technology, also had a scholarship to study the humanities, and we had one of the most interesting interviews that I personally have experienced since I came to join SAIS. Finally, last but not least, Anand Kandaswamy, who is also here at SAIS at the moment. He has a JD degree from Yale Law School, a BA from Rutgers, and is a current and active member of the New Jersey State Bar. I'm going to let Jeff talk a little bit about how the journal was produced this year. The students who contributed to the journal will then talk a little bit about what Stalemates, how they contributed to the theme of Stalemates, and then we'll ask Professor Heuser to give her talk, and we'll hopefully have a very interesting and lively discussion. Jeff, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gilbert. Contrary to what he said, he's much more than an advisor. He's given us great guidance throughout the year, and we owe very much of the debt of gratitude to Professor Gilbert. And I saw Professor Cheza shaking his head during the introduction. I have moved out of strategic studies and into American foreign policy, so I'm no longer with Professor Cheza. So it's been a great pleasure for us to produce this journal. We've worked with some great people, students, faculty, even some wonderful Italian printers who've been very helpful. So it's a great pleasure to introduce it to you all here today and to have you inside on such a pretty day. So I just want to run through a little bit about how we produce the journal, the process through the year, and then I will give equal time to the folks who have articles in the journal but are not sitting up here with us today, and I'll tell you a little bit about what they've written. So, as Professor Gilbert said, we are a student-run, completely student-run journal of academic journal of international affairs. This is the 17th year that the journal has been produced here at SAIS Europe, and the earlier editions have been a great resource for us. In October, there's a meeting in which we elect an editor-in-chief out of people that are interested in working with the journal. Each potential candidate pitches an idea for a unifying theme for the journal. So in a conversation with some friends the night before, I was helped in coming up with the idea of stalemates, which unfortunately are an important part of the international system today. So I'll just speak a little bit about what we mean by that word. We were thinking of stalemates as the obvious ones: the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Syrian civil war. So problems that are not solved and are sort of locked in a state of stalemate, yeah. But there are other less obvious ones that sort of occurred to us as we started to receive ideas for the journal. So the idea of global climate change, the fact that there's a solution out there that people know needs to be done, but there's not the political will or the international structures to implement it. We got a very interesting article from a woman named Ali Carragher, who was here last year, I believe, and is now at SAIS DC, about a stalemate in the WTO between the imperatives for green development and the WTO's rules, which were sort of written for an earlier era. So we, to our great surprise and pleasure, found the theme to be more widely adaptable than I'd first thought. So after we choose a theme, the editor-in-chief selects executive, managing, and assistant editors, many of whom are here today, who've been a wonderful help to put the journal together and to raise the money which it needs to be printed, which is a part of the job that I did not understand at first, but came to be a large part of our time. So to that end, we plan an event called Mr. and Mrs. SAIS, which is one of the funnest events of the year. It's sort of a beauty pageant cum talent contest, but that doesn't even really begin to describe it. We had some stand-up comedy done in drag this year. We had an amazing guitar performance. It was really quite a showcase of the skills of people here that are not related to international relations theory. So, and from that event, we raised 3,000 or 4,000 euros, which went towards the printing of the journal and will go to print next year's journal. So that event was a great success and a lot of fun. Together, the editors write a call for papers that goes out in November and December to all of the APSIA schools, which is the way we did it this year. So those are schools in the US and all around Europe, Japan, Russia, all over the planet. The call for papers goes out, papers come back. By mid-February, we start a peer review process, which involves a lot of assistant editors. We had 18 this year, and we received more papers, I think, than have ever been received before, about 65 great papers from all around the world. So it was really great to get that many and of that quality. So then we lay out the journal. In my case, we use Adobe's InDesign for the first time and sort of futz around with that program, try to put it together. And then we send it off to the printers and try to write all the papers that we've put off during the course of laying out the journal. So let me just give a quick rundown of the articles that are not represented here, and then we'll hear from the authors that we have here. So our first interview was with Professor Filippo today, who's sitting right here, and this year has branched out from his academic career into political advice, working as an advisor to Matteo Renzi, who's the relatively new Prime Minister of Italy. So we talked to Professor today about Prime Minister Renzi's economic plans, his plans for reform of the Italian economy. So it's a very interesting interview. After that, we had some articles from our friends up here, which we'll hear about in a minute, but we also had an interview with Ahmed Rashid, who's a very distinguished Pakistani journalist, an expert on the Taliban. So we spoke to him about what will happen in Afghanistan and Pakistan and India after the Americans leave Afghanistan later this year. We have an article from Nora Sturm, who's a student at SAIS in DC, arguing that peace in Sudan has been ill-served by the ICC arrest warrant against the president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir. So that's a very interesting iconoclastic take on that issue. We interviewed a gentleman by the name of Serge Schmemann, difficult name to pronounce, but he is a member of the New York Times editorial board, a colleague of Dr. David Unger, who is a professor here, and a former Times bureau chief in Moscow and in Jerusalem. And I was actually sitting right here doing that interview the day of or the day after Russia had moved into Crimea. So it was an appropriate time to be talking to a Russia expert. Our next article is from Andrew Watkins, who goes to SIPA at Columbia, but we won't hold that against him or against Dr. Keller for that matter. He wrote a very interesting piece about the PKK, the Kurdish militia group in Turkey, and why their strength has been so resilient against the Turkish state. Another CISER in DC, Mark Sabah, wrote a great piece about the impact of the Syrian civil war on Lebanon, right next door, a very fragile country. Alison Carragher, who I mentioned before, has a piece about the WTO supporting green growth, a very interesting application of our theme to an unconventional issue. Virginia Benninghoff, another SAIS person, about bargaining strategies in climate change negotiations. Very interesting story. A student at Sciences Po in Paris named Claire Lebarbanchon wrote us a very interesting summation of an academic debate about global inequality, whether it's rising or falling, the impact of technology on that. A gentleman named Evan Pfeiffer from LSE wrote about Colombia, the history of political violence in Colombia. Fascinating. And then finally, Michelle Trone, also a CISER in DC, wrote about Sudan's many conflicts along the peripheries and sort of fit that into a theme of periphery versus center conflict. So as you heard from all of those, we solicited articles from around the world, and we published 11. 8 of them are from SAIS people, whether in Bologna or in DC. So I think that really speaks to the quality of the students that we have here, and it was done through a blind peer review process, so no bias. Let me turn it over now to Fritz to tell us about his article about Japanese anti-militarism. But I want to thank again Professor Gilbert and Dr. Keller for their support for this project this year. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and I guess I'll just get into it. Unfortunately for Professor Gilbert, I wasn't able to include Prince William in my article. but really, my article is about a very old stalemate in Japanese politics, which is the issue of military rearmament in the aftermath of World War II. And of course, this is in the context of the Japanese Constitution, which was drafted in 1947 and included the very unique article, Article 9, that promised to forever renounce war as a method of statecraft. This was written and drafted by the Americans in the aftermath of World War II, but by 1949, 1950, with revolution in communist revolution in China and the rising threat of the Soviet Union, U.S. policymakers had a sort of, my God, what have we done moment, and turned back to Japan and started pushing very, very, very hard for them to remilitarize. This process, unfortunately, they ran up against Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru, who was a very centrist politician and was resistant to rearming Japan. But they also released a large number of former imperial regime officials and military officers from prison from the war crimes trials. And by 1955, you had Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, who was a Class A war criminal and a strong supporter of renouncing Article 9 and bringing Japan back to a sort of normal military status. By 1960, it really seemed like the process was going to be reversed and that Japan was going to simply return to its previous state as a normal military power. But of course, at the helm of a man who was really very, very deeply involved in the Japanese war effort during World War II. But a very, an amazing thing happened in 1960, which was during the negotiations to renew the U.S.-Japanese security treaty, a movement called Ampo Toso rose up, which was a broad peace movement across Japanese society that prompted hundreds of thousands to protest against the Kishi government and against the renewal of the security treaty. And this was really, it's really the strongest and most wide and broadest popular resistance movement in Japanese history. It was really something unique in Japanese history, and it was very much focused around painful memories of the war, the anti-nuclear issues, and the issues of military bases. But it drew a huge segment of Japanese society against this sort of return of this imperial, this kind of era of imperial Japan. And so, I mean, that was really the stalemate. You kind of had, Kishi had to resign, and you returned to a very sort of centrist type of politics in Japanese politics, and the idea of taking away Article 9 and returning to a military state really became kind of a holy issue that you just couldn't touch in Japanese politics. And so you had this stalemate for the next, through till the 1990s, between the peace movement, the very strong peace movement on the one side, and the old conservative political elite, some of whom hailed back to the imperial era, imperial Japanese era, some of whom were dissenters at that time, but represented a very conservative class. And especially, you had the rise of a right wing within this elite that wanted to bring Japan back to a military state. So that sort of brings us to today. And where my article goes with this is I look at Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's rise today, and you really have seen the peace movement fade in Japanese society as a strong political movement capable of resisting the right wing in Japanese politics and resisting the conservative political elite. And over the 2000s, especially with Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi, who was able to visit Yasukuni Shrine, where there are several Japanese war criminals interred, with very little public response against this action. You really see the fading of this movement highlighted very vividly. And so today you have Shinzo Abe, who is the grandson of Nobusuke Kishi, former war criminal, very heavily involved in the Imperial Army. He has, during his first term, Shinzo Abe released statements saying that denying the issue, that the fact that comfort women were used by Japanese soldiers during World War II. He's a very divisive figure in international relations and or in East Asia. And you have a very, very strong movement now to bring back the military in Japanese society. And of course, we recently saw President Obama go to Japan and support the reinterpretation of Article 9 towards collective security, and cover the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands underneath the Mutual Security Pact. So, but the conclusion of the article is that this is a dangerous thing for U.S. foreign policy, in that the nationalist aspect of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the movement that he represents has the possibility of drawing the United States into a conflict in East China that it doesn't want to be involved in. So that's the stalemate. That's my argument. Sorry.
Stalemate gone.
Stalemate gone. That's the breakthrough.
Anand.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much for coming. My article's on page 43 if you want to follow along. The issue I was writing about was I'm an American who grew up in the Midwest, but my parents are originally from India, so I'm always interested in the issue of the Kashmiri stalemate, which has basically been going on since the creation of Pakistan and India, for 65 years. And I was just looking at the issue, and I'm like, this is just like a journal article. There's no way I'm going to be like solving like the Kashmir problem in like 20 pages. Like if people have been spending 65 years trying to solve it. But one of the insights I got when I was doing the research and looking at a lot of actually like Pakistani sources, which was very interesting, was that so Pakistan was founded in 47 because they basically said that Gandhi and Nehru and the founders of India, which was going to be a secular country, was not going to give a fair deal to Indian Muslims. So they said, we need to create a country where Indian or South Asian Muslims will have a place, a sphere of their own to grow. And so they created this country of Pakistan. But the founders of Pakistan were actually pretty secular in their outlook. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who's the founder, was like famously a guy who ate pork, drank wine. He didn't follow any sort of like any Islamic codes. So the idea was going to be that Pakistan was going to be for Muslims, but it was going to be a secular state. And the problem that came about was that Pakistan is like a very tribal, caste-riven society, and there are some groups that are more equal than others, particularly the Punjabi and Sindhi speakers, and they basically dominate the commerce and the political leadership of that country. And so what happened was that basically some of these groups who are not included in the power structure, like the Pashtuns, the Balukis, they were basically they found that they were basically second-class citizens in their own country. And in the late 70s, in the early 70s, there was this charismatic figure who came on the scene during the time of the Nixon administration, who was Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, whose daughter Benazir Bhutto would also become famous later on. And he actually came up with this idea, which at the time seemed like, well, not innocent, but it seemed like a good idea, which was that he said, okay, we're Pakistanis and we're divided by language and by regional, so why don't we start emphasizing our common Islamic identity? And that started to cause a lot of problems because he wanted to break up the existing power structures within Pakistan, and he said the way to do that is by emphasizing the Islamic character of the country. And you basically see from the early 70s onwards, you see this long slide in Pakistan into basically becoming very much like a religious state, moving away from the secularism of its founders. And the reason that ties back into the issue of Kashmir is that it becomes very difficult. So Kashmir is, I've never been there, but I've seen pictures, and it's a very beautiful area, but it's not that important like in terms of like its economy, or it has some strategic value, but it's not like it's something that's crucial. But it's really crucial to how the Pakistan kind of defines itself as a country, which is that anywhere where there's a majority Muslim area in South Asia, they feel that that should be a part of Pakistan. So like Kashmir, India claims it as being a part of its own territory, and the Pakistanis kind of see it as an identity issue, and it's especially become more pronounced since the time of Bhutto and then his successor, the man who actually executed him, General Zia. They feel like we can't give this area up, even though it's not of that much importance to us, because it's tied into the Islamic identity of the state, and the Islamic identity is the only thing that's kind of keeping Pakistan together as a country. So if we let Kashmir go, like we're basically going to be kind of undermining the basis for our state, and then we'll have to like deal with all these like minority issues and like the fact that there's different language groups and everything. So so they use Kashmir as a rallying point in some ways to keep the country together, and so. I mean, like, this has been going on for decades, since the 1970s. So there's no like really quick fix to break out of this stalemate. But I mean, I think they kind of have to go back to like the institutions that they had from like roughly from the late 40s to through the mid 60s, which is more secular in character. I mean, like, it's not, you can't like overnight go from being like an Islamist country to a secular country, but you have to start the process. And one way they can do it is that they, like from the 70s onwards, they've been following Islamic law, but before that they used to have secular law. So I think they should like drop these ulemas, like this Islamic code, and go back to the secular laws that they used to have. And basically, it's going to be a long, hard process, but you have to like start it somewhere. And I said in the conclusion, I offer one country as like a model, which is a country that the Pakistanis despise because it used to be a part of their country, which is Bangladesh, which is an Islamic country. It's not quite a secular country, but it offers a better model for what Pakistan should be in the future. So I think like if they become a more secular country, maybe that can help to resolve the Kashmiri stalemate. Thank you.
Thanks, Anand. Last, we'll hear from Jagmeet Turjem about another stalemate in Asia.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Professor Gilbert, for the kind word earlier. My article is on the stalemate in the South China Sea, particularly to do with all the various actors involved in the dispute in South China Sea. It emerged out of my work as an energy consultant. So when I was covering Asia, this region was one of the main focuses. And what I wrote for a 500-word briefing for a boss, I thought this was a good time to expand on that and incorporate more than just energy into it and see where the debates are. So basically, I mean, one is struggling in South China Sea is to contain a rising Chinese presence with the interests of the various countries, as well as in ASEAN, as well as other countries which are involved in it. Chinese claim in the area is based, they cite 2,000 years of history to claim most of the small islands around South China Sea, going down all the way to the coast of Vietnam, to Philippines, even a bit of Malaysia and Indonesia, Brunei, sorry, what they call the 9 dash lines. And a lot of these islands are, if you follow the news, these are the Paracel Island, the Spratly Islands, Carabobo Shoals, etc. The Vietnamese claim is all claim that, I mean, Chinese never claimed it before in the 1940s, and they had a small skirmish. I think around 70 Vietnamese soldiers died in the 1988 in a small naval battle. There's been small skirmishes between Philippines and Malaysia in past history, but nothing that has gone out of proportion. Now it's getting a little more serious now with rising China. And if we explore the various motivation that which is really powering this stalemate, is that there are 3 of them which can be easily identified beyond just the territorial expansionism. One is to do with energy resources. It's home to, well, there are different claims, different organizations have different estimates of the energy resources in the region, but let's say the range of the gas reserve is between 266 trillion cubic feet to 500 trillion cubic feet, depending on who is estimating, whether the US is or the Chinese national oil companies are. But to put the numbers in perspective, Indonesia's total proven reserve for gas is around 107 trillion cubic feet. So you, even at the lower estimate, you're looking at more than the entire Indonesian gas reserve. And that's potentially something to grab for, not just for China, but even for the Southeast Asian countries, where it's a lot more crucial for them, because that's their main energy source, and they're not being able to command that much of a market like Chinese do in the natural, international energy trade. The second thing that is at stake is the sea trade route. It's probably one of the busiest, if not the busiest, sea trade route in the world, the Strait of Malacca, that thing going all the way to Japan and South Korea and China. Energy trade is huge. Japan, China, and South Korea being the first and the second largest LNG or liquefied natural gas importer in the world. So you have that at stake. And the third thing is the fishing economy, which depends a lot on these areas. So what is happening now, and if you follow the news, is that the Chinese expansionism is being challenged by the different ASEAN countries. ASEAN countries have become, especially Vietnam and Philippines, are becoming a lot more aware of a rising China. The positions are different. The Chinese want to negotiate bilaterally, and legitimately the ASEAN countries individually do not feel powerful enough to negotiate bilaterally with China. They want to negotiate with ASEAN as a bloc. So what was interesting that happened in 2012 was that when ASEAN tried to issue a joint statement against China after their meeting, they were not able to do so for the first time in the history of ASEAN. China kind of used their proxy nations where they had influence, like Cambodia and Laos, to shoot down the joint communique that was meant to be issued. So there is an interesting geopolitics at play. ASEAN is not being able to negotiate multilateral as a group. China wants a bilateral negotiation where they'll have more of a voice in the negotiation table. And then the interesting part where the stalemate gets even more complicated is the involvement of the other countries, the non-ASEAN and non-Chinese nations. Vietnam, for example, has been trying to entice Indian oil companies to start owning stakes in gas and oil fields in South China Sea. So even when Indian national oil company ONGC decided to go back because they were not enough economically viable to own that asset, they started giving more incentive to keep holding on to those assets. There was a time when the Chinese kind of said to the Indians, please stay away from this. And the Indian Navy is like, no, it's our asset and we'll protect it. So they're trying to get all these external actors to play his part. Another country, which follows a bit with on Fritz's analysis, is to do with Japan and Japanese involvement. They are also particularly, they have a stake in keeping the sea route open, and they have been really involved with the region. Especially after the election of Shinzo Abe, they have been engaging a lot more with the region. Myanmar is where Japanese investment is going a lot, and that's helping kind of decrease Chinese influence in ASEAN internally. Even Philippines, which have had a bad history with Japanese soldiers during the World War, have come to terms with it and trying to get the Japanese on board in helping strengthen their position. Shinzo Abe calls this South China Sea Lake Beijing. He calls for a security diamond to contain the rising Chinese power of India, US, Australia, and Japan itself. So that's where the interesting bit is. The US involvement is also required. Definitely, they're not going to be, no solution imposed by the US is going to be acceptable to the Chinese. But what the US involvement helps is strengthen the position of these small countries, who otherwise will not have that much of a voice in any negotiation. So it kind of worsens the stalemate a bit. Or makes it better, and depends on how you look at it. And the last thing I wanted to add is that the impact on the energy side, which is where my main focus was when I started it, was that there's not the investment in exploration and production has been dwindling in that region, especially for smaller countries like Philippines, which is trying to explore a gas field in this part called Reed Bank. The field is called Sampaguita. It's one of the main gas fields that they want to explore, but it hasn't been able to do so because the Chinese will not let them. Vietnam wants to explore its South China Sea assets. That's not happening. So within that context, they are diversifying away from their earlier reliance on gas. So coal is becoming big. They want to import more LNG. So the dynamics on energy in Southeast Asia is also changing because of it. But I've just ended with the small quote by the Prime Minister of Singapore when he was asked by CNN how he sees the situation and is there any resolution to it. And his comment was that it's a problem which cannot be solved. It has to be managed, and that's the reality of it, and that's where the stalemate is. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, as you can see, students at SAIS are doing rich, challenging, interesting, and thematically interesting papers. We thought that when I was talking with Jeffrey, we thought it would be a very good idea to add to the mix, because inevitably the journal contained disparate articles from different parts of the world on different themes, to have a general reflection on stalemates in international affairs. So what I thought we could do now is have the lecture from a talk from Professor Huser on the general theme of stalemates. And then I'll open the floor to your questions and comments, both on the papers that we've already, on the presentations we've already heard, on the journal itself, and of course on the lecture we're about to hear. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It is a very great honor to be here today, and it is very challenging indeed to be talking to such an audience, including people who've been practitioners in government, people who've been in international industry, and many of you who know infinitely more about particular subject areas of international relations than myself. So I'm very grateful to the director and like the colleagues here at SAIS for having invited me, but it is quite a challenge. But think of what I'm about to say as an intellectual aperitif to get you stimulated for lunch and further discussion. There are three areas of stalemates that I see. The concrete conflicts that have been addressed by some of the excellent papers that we've just heard presentations about, and the other papers that are in this volume. And I'm not going to take you into regional issues because most of you here will know much more about at least one region than I do. There are stalemates, I would also suggest to you in a second part, in our thinking about the international system. And I think there are beyond that stalemates in our own conceptualization of politics, both domestic and international. Let me try to take you with me in my development of ideas. It's a good coffee easier now. I've had 3 points, you've noticed. Let me try to take you along on the road of what I'm trying to explore, which is that there are problems in international relations which seem to have mutually irreconcilable features, resulting in logical stalemates, in dichotomies that seem irresolvable. I suggest to you that this is not God-given or nature-given. It is the result of the way in which we conceptualize the world. Now, human ingenuity, reflection, and thinkers standing on the shoulders of other thinkers have in the past managed to come up with some solutions by reconceptualizing these apparently irreconcilable antitheses. And let me just give you 3 examples of where this has happened, looking at the vast span of past history. 250 years of intense religious wars have plagued Europe. And we came out of those, although there are still elements of religious confessional war in Europe, most notably in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, we came out of it by the consensus of laïcisme, of secularization, of grosso modo dividing the church from the state and declaring one to private sphere and the other as a public sphere. This did come at a cost. It meant that Christianity has waned all over Europe, and the comfort it provided to many of us waned as well. But it has resulted in this absence of that as an area of strife. And I was very impressed by your paper when you said that in a way this would be for Pakistan the obvious way to go. I think most Islamic conflicts that we see today would find that as a solution, and in most Muslims I talk to tend to say that whenever we sort of say, you know, we had this and we came to a solution, they say, no, this would be Western imperialism to accept that. We can't possibly accept that. But let's just say this is one example where we've come out with a reconceptualization of politics. The second one is to see conflicts, particularly international conflicts and also political conflicts, as zero-sum games, which, taking our cues from economics, we have reconceptualized as being potentially win-win situations, situations of trading, of commerce, where both sides can have an advantage which massively outweighs the disadvantages of having big, bloody, costly wars, or even just small wars. Occasionally, bad remedies to intractable long-term situations have been invented. I would suggest it to you that the invention of nationalism that came in a world where people's automatic devotion to their princes, their lords, their masters, was waning, where there was less and less of a reason for people to make sacrifices for a bigger community. Nationalism was, if you like, constructed, invented, to secure people's loyalty and willingness to make sacrifice for the Benedict Andersonian imagined community. But that in its turn then became a huge mainspring for conflict and is only arguably being overcome now in some post-nationalist countries and communities which are still, however, beset by all sorts of nationalist and separatist movements, like in the European Union. I'm thinking of our wonderful referendum in Scotland in the autumn, and I think it is an injustice that as an English person I can't vote there. Anyway, so let me eliminate the whole area of regional conflicts, which you've heard about and which is very important, obviously, and let me turn to, I think, intellectual stalemates in the international system, not just intellectual but also political, where there are several organizations which have for a long time now been caught in a seemingly insurmountable dichotomy between two mutually exclusive elements. Let's start with the UN. For the reform to work, for UN reforms to work, and I'm phrasing Frederick II of Prussia here, it merely requires the self-abrogation of the privileges in being of the members of the P5 and similar trifles. Yeah? The fact is you have a situation whereby a number of countries have the privileges that they're clinging on to, and they're the ones on whom around whom change would revolve. Now, the inherent problem of the United Nations is that it is a merger of two conflicting conflicts, or two different concepts, namely one that we had in the Concert of Europe, the idea that a very small number of states are running the whole show, versus the League of Nations, where you had all members equals, with the result that no collective action could ever come out of it because of the many different votings. So we have the inherent problems of equality of all states, large or small, or some directoire of the few largest ones. Should a handful of bigger states dominate the smaller states? How can they be prevented from running the show entirely in their own interest? So the veto power. How can the organization function with selfish P5s, let alone selfish P8s or P10s, even when you're just talking about decision making, as we have seen that even this small number of countries has so very rarely managed to get their act together to have a joint resolution on something. And what qualifies you for being one of the chosen few, and how can others with a good claim persuade those who are in to accept that they would be in? Let's turn to the European Union. The European Union has admittedly come a long way since its inception. Where European Economic Communities, the European communities of the mid-50s. Nevertheless, it has gone nowhere near as far as some of its founding fathers had hoped in the 1950s. The decision-making process is obviously also there bedeviled by the fact that it is very large. Although the decision-finding process is different there, and there are elements where you have a qualified majority vote, it is much more difficult to come to a conclusion there than within, obviously, a single state. It has not become a federal state. We have had the big dichotomy of widening or deepening. It has gone grosso modo for widening. The effect of it is that there is not enough central control of the individual states. See the Greek crises and other financial crises. How can you get 28 states to agree on anything painful for all of them? This is where, when I claimed earlier that the European Union was so wonderfully post-national, I have to admit that I was, to a large extent, also talking through my hat. How can people who over 200 years have been indoctrinated by nationalism, even today, put their self-interest below that of a greater imagined community than that of the nation state? So that is a remaining problem there. A primary question of identity that academics have written about an awful lot in the context of the European Union has still not been resolved, and that is the one of what Europe is, where it ends. What is the West? What part of the West is Europe? How does it relate to the rest of the West? What are the formative experiences of the European Union that qualify you for being part of the European Union? For example, I remember an international conference on European identity that I attended in Madrid, which was around the 11th of November of a year, I don't know, early 90s or something, and I took little poppies. You know, the British have this poppy thing that they have in order to commemorate the war dead and around that time. And I took a bunch of poppies to my colleagues. And it suddenly struck me, of course, that the people in Spain had no inkling of this because Spain had not been part of the First World War. So whereas while the French and the Germans and everybody else said, oh yes, what a wonderful thing, and yes, this is all about European identity, the Spanish looked at me in great puzzlement. It's not just East European countries which don't totally share some of the rituals now that we have of commemoration and of rejection of war that some other countries have developed. So, what is it to be European? That simply it's been written about massively, it still hasn't been resolved. Very briefly, let me touch on the African Union, which now has 54 members, and from that immediately you can deduce that it will have all the problems of decision-making of the European Union or NATO, at least in another magnified size. There again, you have an extraordinarily divergent historical experiences. If you're talking about European identity being difficult to find, how can you put all the countries, the member states of the African Union, into something that has a group of people that have a consensus on historical formative lessons learned from particular joint shared experiences? And there, if you think that nationalism isn't entirely dead in Europe, nationalism has only been recently discovered in countries that are post-colonial and are therefore treasured much more. And this is, I promise, this is the only academic that I will invoke, or the only writer that I'll invoke, not entirely an academic, but also mainly a practitioner, Robert Cooper, British diplomat and then long-time advisor of Javier Solana when he was at the European Union, who had this wonderful conceptualization of the world being divided into pre-modern, modern, and postmodern states, where he saw the European Union states as postmodern states, i.e. modern, he defined as states that claim the monopoly of the use of force and can defend the monopoly of the use of force, where the pre-modern states are still quarreling internally, or their populations are quarreling about who should have the monopoly of the use of force and what the state is and what, where its limits are. In Africa, you have this the classic case of states still being very much in formation and challenges against the states falling apart again, etc., meaning that they're not yet fully arrived at the situation of modern states, the ones where the borders are fixed and the monopoly of the use of force is fully established. I will not go into ASEAN or NATO, but just many other international organizations deserve to be mentioned here, but in the interest of time, I will move on to my third part, which is the one of our own conceptual blockage, our own conceptual limitations of our understanding of the world. So let me start with our imagined communities. Having constaté, having arrived at the point where we realize that how we perceive ourselves is constantly shifting, but is very much subject to manipulation and also our own convictions and values, we see the international system, the very word suggests that there is a problem there because there's this assumption that it's something to do with relations between nations. Like this problem can't be taken away by suddenly calling it transnational all the time. But it leads to a question of how we conceive ourselves, and I've been the fascinated observer in many meetings, particularly when I was at NATO, where people would click in and out of different definitions of we. It's great fun because you can observe people talking, and the British diplomat Pleasant would be talking about we, and he would go from this meaning the United Kingdom to this meaning the Anglosphere, this meaning NATO as a whole, this meaning the liberal world in more general terms. All of a sudden Australia was on the horizon. And you can see this happening during a conversation among very, very educated and very politically conscious people. They're still clicking in and out of different imagined communities as they're going along. I think we have a particular conceptual blockage in thinking about states and the international system, and this is the bit where I always say Hegel is greatly at fault here. The adulation of the state that's come out of, yes, not just Germany, but also France in the 19th century has, particularly, of course, in international law, elevated it to the highest possible position, even though I shall concede that it is sifting gradually, and so throughout the 90s and early 2000s, there has been much more emphasis on international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the rights of individuals, and attempts to find ways of protecting groups that are not represented by states themselves, but even are persecuted by states. But the whole thinking of, the very word international, let me just take you through the etymology of the word national here. because it has two things. Obviously, it comes from the Latin term of the law of peoples and law of nations, but it is also linked to the fact that English doesn't have a proper adjective for state. So the word national tends to substitute for étatique, staatlich, with the result that there is an immense, powerful fusion of two very important terms, namely the adulation that you find in the Franco-German world of the state, l'État, capital E always, and the nation, which is the sort of greatest good of the republic, if you like, which at all times seems to eclipse the danger that that entity is not really acting in the interest of its population, doesn't consult it, and is doing something which is really in the interest of an elite, a regime, etc. One of the fun lines that I learned at NATO was that there was a bit when the diplomats in their various capitals would talk to their colleagues in the ministries of defense, etc., which would be called "nations are consulting." Now, having a long time lived in London where the Clapham omnibus runs, I used to think of myself on the Clapham omnibus being consulted. Nations are deliberating. And all the people on the Clapham omnibus thinking, shall we now invade Yugoslavia or should we not? You know, it simply isn't the case. It is a way in which the representative, elected representatives of a country and the civil servants and the military who serve them are fused with the power of the whole nation and given the cachet of the legitimacy of the whole nation, that here ceases to differentiate between the actual population who may have an opinion and would in Switzerland express it through a referendum, and just that small elite who are actually taking decisions in that context. And other things that are very, very 19th century are still the way in which the political system works in most countries, which was conceived in laid down in the 19th century with the two houses of parliament in most countries and similar constructions, and the way the electoral system works, which is all variations on a theme that was conceptualized in the 19th century. I alluded to something at the beginning, which I think is still very much with us, although I claimed rashly that it had been resolved. Namely, it is our thinking about war and peace and things like victory, one of my favorite subjects, as Michael knows, which is still very much conceptualized by many people in many contexts as zero-sum thinking. Most recently, you will see this is reflected in how anybody, all sides, perceive what's going on in Ukraine. There does not seem to be a vision of a win-win situation, and there does not seem to be a vision of anything that could be as mutually satisfactory to all sides as is the current situation of Alsace-Lorraine or of Alto Adige, which simply has, you know, in a way you could say there were similar elements there, comparable elements, and yet there simply isn't a problem today, whereas obviously in the Ukraine nobody seems to be able to look at it in that way and sees it as zero-sum thinking. I've just mentioned, let me reiterate this our thinking about what constitutes success and victory. It is so deeply ingrained in our culture that a conflict has to end with one side triumphant and the other side crushed and humiliated. That we are constantly falling back into this pattern when it is one that is quite alien to the entire world of commerce and trade, etc., and should be alien to any world that is even faintly influenced by ideas and notions of Christianity or any other major religion that I know of. When we should not be thinking of the outcome of a situation as one in which we are happy to have humiliated another side or be happy with the situation of being humiliated, but in which we should try to find something that others can live with. And there is a long, long tradition of seeing warfare and conflict in the context of thinking beyond that war, the Aristotelian concept that a war is only just if it can lead to a lasting and just peace, which was abandoned in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and which is still only in the process of making a comeback. I see that there's a lot of reflection of this nowadays in thinking, where people say, Petraeus, others said in the context of Iraq, we shouldn't talk about victory. It wasn't that sort of thing. It was something about making a state viable, and that was a quite different thing from being having a victory march, anything like that, and having Roman laurels or a victory arch constructed. But it still is so inherent in military thinking, military planning, and anything to do with the use of force in a violent context, that it is very, very difficult to overcome and evacuate. Let me list a few unresolved dilemmas which are with us and simply we haven't overcome in our own thinking. One of them is the universality of human rights versus the commitment to respect and preserve diverse cultural heritages. I know that I am on the extreme human rights side of that debate, but the more I listen to others, the more I see that others are saying this is a totally unrealistic 18th century view of the world. I'm happy to be 18th century, but apparently it's not realistic today. But no, still, I'm taking it very seriously that I'm being told time and again that the universal concept of human rights, that after all member states of the UN have signed up to, are difficult to apply in some cultures. The very least I have to do by way of making a concession is to say that it is clearly an illusion on the part of me and other 18th century people that human rights adopted in 1948 simply can be applied all over the world without greatest difficulties. Equality and diversity is another such point. To what extent are we all committed to equal chances for all? To what extent are we prepared to be tolerant of the intolerant? To what extent do we favor competition over social security? Or to what extent, what sacrifices are we prepared, this is obviously a European perspective, to make for social security when we know that it incurs the huge danger of making us so much less competitive? Those are some of those dilemmas and dichotomies that I'm referring to that I think could be overcome with greater human ingenuity, but there is a big challenge because they have not so far. A next one is a very tentative one because I shouldn't be straying into the realms of domestic politics. I simply don't know enough about them. But I feel that after we have fought for democracy for centuries, what we have in most Western countries is a democratic fatigue. Where political parties in the West look more and more alike, electoral participation seems to be waning, and governments are becoming, even more than was imaginable in Max Weber's time, administrators rather than political machines where these different debates are fought out. And particularly they're seen by electors as unreasoning machines. But heavens, what else could be better than democracy? So we have this quandary that on the one hand we find that all politicians lie and politics becomes more and more scandalous and banal, and yet there seems to be no better system that is invented and may a greater force protect us from any returns to authoritarianism or anything else. But clearly some reform, something new is needed here in order to make politics attractive again, and clearly I think the world is waiting for that. My final example here is that of conflicts outside our own sphere, where if you have a conflict, logic suggests that something is rotten, something is wrong, something needs to address. There are clearly some changes needed in some words, and this is, I'm basing myself there on a pretty vast literature on insurgencies and the causes of insurgencies going back all the way to the late Middle Ages, where that recognition has gradually increased and dawned on people. You simply can't suppress movements of unhappiness by saying go away, you're actually fine as you are. Something has to be done. So we identified that there is a crisis out there, people are killing each other, and we'd like them to stop because we think that's in their interest. We can't go back to the status quo, because obviously there was something wrong with the status quo, otherwise you wouldn't have had that bloody conflict. So what do? On the basis of all the things I just enumerated, democracy, idea of social security, redistribution of goods, statehood, state building, which Americans call nation building. I've told you what I think is wrong with that word. And all of those, we tried then to propose those as resolutions to the problem. And the immediate accusation that is leveled against us is that this is Western neocolonialism and inappropriate for the cultures to which we're trying to apply them. On the other hand, I don't see any alternative. You know, the problem was there was a conflict there, and we have the institutions we have developed over centuries, through many, many bad experiences with wars, are these institutions. These are the best we have worked out. There are many variations among them, but grosso modo they're parliamentary systems and their elections and democracy, etc. And that's what we can propose. The alternative is non-involvement. But then that's not acceptable either. So this is a terrible quandary, I think, for Western powers. All these dilemmas require practical solutions, and theory is only useful if it leads to new practical solutions. But we must be careful not to drive out the devil with Beelzebub, the prince's competition for power and riches, for example, by nationalism, as I suggested earlier. So this is an entirely theoretical approach. I'm telling you where the research has to be done, but I think with practical solutions in mind, it's a great agenda for IR and for political science. And we would do well to take advice here from other areas, from economics, anthropology, comparative history. There is much to do for SAIS and others. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, I'm going to throw the floor open for questions now, both to Professor Huse and to the different student panelists. And I'm also hoping that some of the student panelists will want to ask questions about the lecture we've had today. But while you're gathering your thoughts, I'm going to ask a question, abusing my position as chair. There was a theme running through your talk, I thought, which was that in a way we're not conceptually wired to break stalemates without conflict. We as human beings are connected to our ideas, our ideologies, our institutions, our being, our identities, and we are reluctant to take even rational decisions, rational paths out of stalemates that these conflicts resolve. Is that fair?
I think it's very fair. One of the things I have observed with the great age I now have is that whenever we put on our scholarly hats, we're terribly rational. And a colleague of mine recently wrote a beautiful paper on whether Hobbes believed in God or not, splitting many a fine hair and coming to the ultimate conclusion that he did. And I wonder whether the reality is, when we don't put on our scholarly hats, that we are so contradictory as human beings that, for example, our good Hobbes must on his deathbed have believed in God, and there were other moments when he didn't. What I'm saying is that I think we are, the reality is very complex, and we sometimes err as scholars on the side of trying to see coherent logical patterns where in our own personalities we wouldn't necessarily find them.
Anybody, please. At the back in the black shirt.
Oh, sorry. I have the microphone.
Oh, sorry, you've got the microphone. Sorry, I thought you were handing... Okay, please. Okay, first the lady with the microphone, then the
Yes,
gentleman in
I'll
back
pass
with
it
the
on.
black shirt.
Thank you so much for the lecture, Professor Horser. It was it actually touched me personally because I'm working in the area of corporate social responsibility, and I think that business and human rights is really an emerging topic. And looking at all the things that you've addressed, I look at business actually and say businesses are coming together to cross nations and to overcome conflict, to set standards actually that they want to implement within their supply chains to impact nations, to impact vulnerable groups as well, and increase livelihoods and the standard of living wherever they are doing business. And so I just wanted to thank you for that lecture, because it actually rang true to what I do personally and how actually businesses can overcome some of these stalemates that we are facing today. Thanks.
Okay, the gentleman at the back. I'll take three or four at a time. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. My connection is also slightly personal, although through it's my father. My father was a student in Pakistan when the partition occurred, so this addresses the article that you wrote and that I read the conclusion of. And maybe a few days before the partition, he was on a train back, and he saw lots of horrific incidents on both sides of what then became the border. So it was very touching. And where I want to bring this to is I know there are many reasons for conflicts and stalemates, and you hit upon many of them. And one of them is probably religion. We talked about some of the religious issues, and then we talked about territorial and economic issues in terms of the conflicts and stalemates. So my question actually is, and I'm going to go out on a limb, and perhaps in this community it's not too bad to do that. Why should not secularism be taught and promoted as an institution, which actually means undoing one of the institutions that have developed the power of the church in Christianity, or the power of Islam, or Hinduism, whatever those tenets of religion are that promote divisions among people. So we can't perhaps solve all the problems that we talked about in terms of the conflicts, but perhaps as a nation, as a global nation, we can promote tolerance and secularism, if that indeed may lead to resolution in many conflicts. And I can, in India, Pakistan, as your article pointed out, is one of them, but there are many others. There's Israel, Palestine, there's the Irish situation, and China, Tibet, and there are various areas where this can be applied. So as a society, regardless of the Hobbes question, whether they believed in God or not, I guess, I think one of the institutions we perhaps need to figure out how to move towards to make our world a better place for all people to live in is how do you address the concept of religion, which often leads to deeper issues of nationalism. And in the US, perhaps another conflict that you can add to your list is the conflict of gun control. It's also a stalemate. It's a domestic issue, but often there are many ties to leanings towards strong sides of religion that influence such questions. So I would submit to you in this hypothesis that amongst all these issues, religion is one of the ones that we can perhaps start making moves towards that can be perhaps addressed in our generation for the benefit of us and our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'll take one more question, and then we'll have a second round in a moment, and I'll ask it. One more question over here
Not to prolong the discussion, but on the issue of Kashmir, I lived for 6 years in Pakistan, and their position was that the Indian side of the issue was more politically based as to why they took Kashmir at the time of partition, because all the other Indian states voted as to whether or not they wanted to join India or Pakistan. And the Pakistanis fully expected to have Kashmir because their population, the Muslim population, is what, 90%? And so the fact that there was some skullduggery going on as to why Kashmir joined India instead of, because of the power of the Maharaja at the time, and he was related to the Nehrus and so forth, so he cast his vote, just to be on the safe side, he thought, to India. Since then, the Pakistanis have suggested one way to resolve the issue is to hold a plebiscite and ask the Kashmiris if they want to be independent or go with India or go with Pakistan. And the Indians have consistently refused. So I think if we could prod the Indians just a little more to make them realize that they are governing a people that really do not want them. And this isn't to say that they want to be with Pakistan either, because many of them have voiced the notion that they would like to be Kashmiris and let it go. So I'm just wondering if this might be one way to sort of nudge this stalemate into oblivion, because just give the people the power to say where they want to go.
Okay, can we have one more question? And the gentleman in the glasses here, please.
Thank you. I'm surprised that nobody is talking about economic interests or the role of multinational organizations in the creation or softening of stalemates. I give the example of Mr. Ning Chu Jam, who talked about Chinese influence, and they raising their military expenditure so much because they're so interested in the resources of the South Chinese Sea. And in this case, is the economic interest was prevailing. The same at the moment that the Russians were taking over Odessa, Sebastopol, the CEO of Siemens was talking with Putin. And all the German industries were very angry that there would be taken too much sanctions against Russia. So that's my problem. And my question, how does the role of international economic organizations have changed the approach to stalemates?
Okay. Anand, why don't you answer the questions on the Kashmir first, and then I'll ask Professor Houser also to make a reply.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. I'll try to answer both questions as quickly as possible. You're absolutely right with respect to the issue of Kashmir. I don't think, I mean, it's been dirty pull on the part of both India and Pakistan. When the countries were being, when they were becoming independent, the Maharaja, who was a Hindu ruling over a mostly Muslim territory, actually wanted to have a separate country. And the last Viceroy of India, Lord Mountbatten, the godfather of Prince Charles, he said, no, this is not viable. You have to pick one or the other country. Kashmir on its own will not survive, like in this Cold War world that we're seeing coming into shape. So you have to pick. And then basically, like, the Hindu ruler decided he wanted to be independent, but he decided at the end, like, it's better maybe to be under India's blanket. Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, neither country, neither India nor Pakistan has ever like really played fair with the issue of the plebiscites. Like, the Kashmiri political opinion is actually a bit. I don't know. Like, it's gone all over the place over the past few years. I mean, like, I don't know whether it can survive as a viable independent country. I think for security and economic reasons, it would be better if it chose to be part of either Pakistan or India. But maybe it's someone who has more knowledge of the economic and security situation can correct me on that. The issue that I was getting to is that like, there was just this fundamental change, I think, that in Pakistani politics, which the other gentleman in the back addressed, which is that from the 70s onwards, like, Pakistan just became a fundamentalist. It started sliding into this fundamentalist Islamism, and that it makes it much harder because basically the political elites, so some of them, like the Bhuttos, were just embracing Islamism for very venal political reasons because they saw it as a way to achieve power. But the problem is that now you've had 40-something years of these, you've had madrasas, you've had the ulemas, the Islamic codes, and you can't just get rid of that process overnight. So when you turn back to like secularism, it's not going to be like the kind of secularism that we're going to recognize in the West. It's going to be something that will be something with an Islamic character, and you basically move in steps and in processes. So, I mean, basically the Kashmir or Jammu and Kashmir, it's the area is called, like, Pakistan controls its part and then India controls its part. And for the past couple of years, I think, like, when Musharraf was still in power about like 6-7 years ago, there was kind of a tentative idea that maybe the line of control, they would kind of split Kashmir, so whatever Pakistan currently controls would go to Pakistan, whatever India currently controls would go to India. That's not an ideal situation, but they were going to make the border like porous and let people travel without like special visas across the border, so that over time maybe the country would become united. I just think, like, what happened is that it's, in my opinion, I absolutely think like the Indian government has not been playing fair with the issue of the plebiscites. I just think that the Pakistani politics for the past 40 years has made Kashmir like a central part of their national identity, and that there's no way to unwind that from the national identity. So, like, they can't really resolve the issue unless they start like looking within and like solving some of their own internal political problems. That was just my issue.
Okay, Jack, perhaps you'd like to address the question of economic change.
It's interesting you mentioned the point about economic interests helping tame down the stalemate or exacerbate it. So in context of South China Sea, it's definitely, there's a lot of economics at play, which is not letting it flare up so much. You have this huge Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia who are mostly the business owner and traders and that part of the economy, and that really helps in keeping the situation under control. You have huge trading relationship with China, and I think Professor Plummer is going to give another talk on these trading partnership. But China is already in talks for opening up free trade agreement with ASEAN and other countries, the RCEP, the TPP, etc. So I mean, these interests actually helps keep the stalemate under control and not let it flare up, because there's a lot to lose. Even when it comes to the trading route, the sea route through the Strait of Malacca, even Chinese have an interest as equally high as Japan in keeping the sea trade route open. So things like that are keeping the stalemate under control. Even the Chinese oil and gas companies are trying to work with the Philippines to jointly explore gas and oil in that region. In that respect, yeah, that's how the economics work, and in dampening the situation. I just wanted to add a small thing on the India-Pakistan question, because I come from my state in India is also one of the most separatist-prone state. There's a lot of history to it. We claim that our narrative claims that our king was meant to sign the secession agreement with a gun on his head 2 years after India became independent. So there's a lot of separatist. The economists called us the wild, wild east of India. So if you want to get the term, but separatism is pretty much fairly there in the society. My only I do sympathize with a lot of the causes as well. But if I have to tell the separatist elements in my society, is that that was a very turbulent point in history where you could not exist as an independent small kingdom that easily. You would have come under the influence of a China, Pakistan, or Myanmar, if for my region specifically. My question to them is, who would you rather be part of at that point in history? The reason why you can have a separatist voice and being able to vent out your political opinion is that you're part of a democracy. How much flawed it is a democracy, and you're allowed to voice your opinion. Another thing is that the danger of having a plebiscite is that the separatist element have not thought about the economics. Hurriyat Conference, which is the one of the more politically softer separatist element in Kashmir, was asked in an interview, what have you thought about in terms of the economics, how are you going to run Kashmir if you ever get an autonomy or independence? They didn't have an answer. How are you going to hand power over to even to people like that? So yeah.
Okay, Beatrice.
On the religious question, I think in Europe we've gone a long way towards that. I believe the majority of schools in the United Kingdom, at least state schools, would have an ethics class rather than religious instruction, and I think that's true for France as well and for other countries. So I think on the whole, in this postmodern European Union, we've gone a long way in that direction. However, I believe that I'm led to believe, I'm not an expert on this, that the life expectancy of somebody in an Islamic country saying what you've just said would not be great. So I think that's the crux there. And getting back to, if we try to export laïcisme, and I'm one of the people who keep saying this, then we are not welcome, because it's, as I said, you're sort of Western whatever, colonialism, imperialism. On the question of economics, if you look at it historically, there has been an enormous band or scale of different attitudes that big economic enterprises have had with regard to the labor force. From the most benign form that exists in the town where I currently work, in Reading in the United Kingdom, where there was a very famous biscuit factory, Palmer and Huntley. The Palmers and the Huntleys were Quakers, and the town is absolutely littered with big buildings that the Palmers and the Huntleys built from their profits. The University of Reading would not exist if it hadn't been for enormous financial investments by these families, who also built almshouses, etc., and were incredibly committed to the well-being of the workforce. And on the extreme other end of the spectrum, you've had IG Farben, the German enterprise working under the National Socialists, who saw that their labor saw their labors in terms of replaceable commodities, whom they worked to death and then replaced by other political prisoners and above all Jewish forced labor. So I don't think that you can generalize about how big companies use the labor force and to what extent they are necessarily going to have a benign influence on the situation. One of the complaints that I hear, I'm not an expert, but one of the complaints I hear most frequently about Chinese big business, particularly in Africa, is that they're precisely not particularly interested in intervening in the political, economic, financial, etc., social structures of the countries in which they're investing in Africa, and that this is one of the great problems facing Africa today. But I've been talking very interestingly to a number of alumni yesterday who have experience in business, and I was told there by one gentleman in particular that he was very skeptical about the willingness of big business to forsake economic profit for the sake of investment in what seem to be airy-fairy projects and not necessarily something that will have concrete returns.
One last round of questions. Hands going up everywhere. I have the lady at the front, the lady at the back in black, and the other lady at the back in black. Sounds like a pop song from the 1970s, but carry on.
Okay, I have a question. It's, what is the difference between tariffs and duties? Because I was reading an article and I always thought they were interchangeable. And the second question is, Cameron came out saying that we were a Christian, well, the UK was a Christian country, and he got absolutely pillared in the press, which I thought was quite funny. Anyway.
Thank you. I work in the area of international exchange, and two stalemates that recently affected my work were with Iran and Myanmar. But those have loosened up in both cases, and we're starting to think about sending U.S. students to Iran and sending U.S. students to Myanmar. So I wonder, my question is, what can we learn from those recent loosenings of stalemates to apply to current stalemates, I think especially Myanmar? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Eve Trezza, and I'm a graduate of 71, Bologna and Washington. And mine is not really a question, it's a comment after 40 years. And I wish I were a student again, because you raised so many issues. And I'm thinking, if I were a student again here at SAIS, I would follow courses like War Seen Through the Eyes of Shakespeare, or Did Hobbes Believe in God? Because even this title, Stalemates, I wonder, philosophically speaking, isn't stalemates the alternative to war in all the cases you put forward here? I mean, when we speak about the status quo, aren't we saying perhaps it's better than the other option? So this is just to put a big other question. Thank you.
I'll allow Professor Hauser to answer that, and then I'll give the last word to Jeff, because we're going to finish perfectly on time.
Don't you want to give these two gentlemen who haven't said very much?
And I don't know, Fritz, if you want to answer either of those questions too.
I think I have something of an answer to your point about stalemates being the alternative to war. I would say that specific to my paper, my article, I would think that the stalemate I was talking about, in a way, yes, it was an alternative to war, but the prolongation of that stalemate over so many decades, and the nature of the issue of the military in Japan, never really, the Japanese society never really faced its war guilt. It never really faced the issue of militarization as an issue in and of itself. It was always a question of World War II was sort of blamed on the imperial army, the imperial leadership, and to a certain extent upon the West. And what you had then was a sort of zero-sum game, or a very fundamental choice between the old conservative political elite and sort of a very blanket anti-peace movement. So I think that in a way, what that allowed was just simply one side to win, rather than actually having a debate between of a sort of third manner. And I think that was something that's true.
I'm afraid I can't possibly comment on Myanmar and what in Iran, simply because this is the sort of thing that I firmly leave to regional specialists, and I am not one for those two, but I find it very interesting what you said, and it gives us hope, what you have told us. But on the issue of Britain and the Christian and non-Christian country, yeah, I think that speaks for itself very much. Well, some of us are a bit annoyed when we can't put up our Christmas decorations, because that's, yeah. Okay, but on the last comment we heard, which I thought was very important, I think mine was a plea, as the same thing that you just said at the very end, was a plea for the third way. And just to give again one very concrete example, it makes me just so sad that the whole issue of insurgency, terrorism, etc. in Israel is addressed with a strategy of mowing the lawn, with the assumption that it will simply continue indefinitely and that one has to come back and somehow repress, kill some terrorists and find some of them, and that this will simply be a situation to which there is no resolution and for which there is no conceivable end state that is acceptable to both sides. That attitude of simply saying it will be a stalemate, it'll cost us lives, it'll be something we can't get out of, is very depressing and very obviously leading to continued violence. It's not just a question of either war or no war, because there's also suffering, etc., involved in the stalemate. And this is why my plea would be for human ingenuity to somehow come up with new solutions, and this to be the place where people should think about these.
Okay, Jeff, a comment.
Sure. I'll try to clean up what's left. I am I'm happy that Professor Plummer, who teaches me in international trade theory, is not here to see me struggle with this tariff duty question. I'll leave it to Professor Today, who's much more capable than I. I will take a crack at the Myanmar-Iran business, though. Those two are interesting examples, I think, because they sort of show that stalemates can be broken in two ways. The first, the Iranian question, has been the subject of much work of diplomats, of policymakers, of people outside government for almost 20 years now. And so hopefully we see that in Geneva they're in the beginning stages of breaking that stalemate. So that's one model, concerted work over many, many years. The Myanmar one is sort of the opposite, because internally they just sort of decided that they wanted to open to the West. And I mean, I'm by no means an expert, but my understanding is that that was the product of internal politics, the sort of moving to the side of a military leader who was very much from the old generation, and a sort of a younger elite moving into power that wanted to open itself to the West. So to me, these represent two different models of the breaking of a stalemate. One that's explicable and the result of a lot of work, and the other that just sort of happens. So I don't know what lessons those draw, and I think this point that you made was brilliant. I was thinking, as you were talking about a metaphor that maybe Dr. Keller would understand, of tectonic plates, right, that build pressure over many thousands, millions of years, and then suddenly they slip against each other and the earthquake happens. So you can look at that of one of two ways. In the aftermath, you can rebuild something that is on a firmer foundation, but you may have lost a lot in that earthquake, which is sort of the war in this example. As the tension builds, no one's getting hurt, but the situation is unresolved, right? So to me, it's difficult to say which is better. You know, it probably depends from where you're sitting. Exactly. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Professor Hooser, for her intervention, and everybody for the very many questions that you've asked. Before we all go to lunch, I'd really like to make a heartfelt thanks to Jeffrey Wright and his team this year. It's really been an absolute pleasure working with them. The journal,
For us now?
yeah, that is what you call a Freudian slip. The journal is, in fact, in the afternoon on sale or more accurately, it is available in the lobby, and there is a suggested donation of €5 if any of you want to see a really brilliantly produced academic work. I think no one reading this journal would doubt for 1 second that it hadn't been produced by a professional publishing house, by academic contributors of the very highest standard. In fact, almost all the academic contributors are graduate students from around the world, and a very high number of them come from SAIS, which I think is something we can all be proud of. Lunch is available in the bar, in the new student lounge, and in the penthouse. You may use this room for eating purposes as well, but I think we should finish with a round of applause to the journalists and to the lecturers.